city. So it was basically, it's been implemented in the city state of Delhi is the way best.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. I'm Dr. Tayyaba Tamim from SOE LUMS. Welcome to the second talk of the series Learning Losses and Challenges. This talk is being co-hosted by Aiyar and SOE LUMS. We are delighted today to have Ms. Yamini Aiyar with us, who is the CEO and President of Center of Policy Research. She has been doing a lot of work in education, and over there, she also initiated an accountability initiative. And this happens to be the largest accountability initiative of the expenditure done on elementary schools in India. Apart from this, Ms. Aiyar is also a part of a number of committees. She's a part of think tanks. She is also a member of United Nations. She's also spearheading RISE India. And apart from that, she has published widely, and she's also a regular columnist at Indian newspapers. So I welcome you. And with me, we have Dr. Rabea Malik, who is moderating this session with me. Dr. Rabea Malik is the CEO and Research Fellow of Ideas. So welcome both of you, and thank you so much, Yamini, for being here. So the floor is yours. So you talk for 30 minutes, and then we follow it up with question answers. Thank you, Rabea, for being here. Thank you so much. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tayyaba, for that very warm introduction. It's an absolute privilege for me to be here and have the opportunity to learn from all of you, and in the process also share some of my work. It is an ongoing body of work, so your feedback, comments, suggestions, and ideas will be extremely helpful for me as we take it forward. In the next 30 minutes or so, what I'm going to present to you is some work I have done on an attempt to try and reform school systems, secondary school systems in India, in the city state of Delhi in India. Before I get into the details, I just wanted to take a few minutes to describe to you why we went into this study in the first place. This is not a study about the outcomes of reform. As in, we didn't set ourselves up to track whether or not an attempt to improve schools, improve teaching and learning in classrooms necessarily resulted in improved learning outcomes. Our motivation was somewhat different. Our motivation stems from the fact that I belong, as Tayyaba said, to a research policy think tank based out of New Delhi. And conversations with bureaucracy is embedded into our ecosystem. We spend a lot of time engaging and interacting with bureaucrats across the country, across different levels. And in some ways, at least the origins of our bureaucracy and your bureaucracy are the same. So some of the pathologies of our bureaucracy and your bureaucracy are also very much similar. And it was something in the course of these conversations. So bureaucracies are always, at least our bureaucracy, particularly the elite Indian administrative services, is quite caught up in a discourse around reform. And that discourse around reform is linked very much to how public also perceives bureaucracy. We all, we are a very argumentative society. We have very strong views. We have very polarized views. But if there's one thing you can find complete consensus on, regardless of what your priors may be, it will be in the fact that the Indian bureaucracy is in crying need for reform, and its ability to translate ideas into practice and implementation effectively and sustainably is really where the big gap lies. And in these conversations about reform, one of the things that I heard repeatedly, both about education, but also about other aspects of what the state is supposed to do, especially when it comes to delivering public services to citizens, was a constant refrain that we're really good at being able to do these missions. So once I was sitting in Bihar, a fly on the wall on a conversation with the education secretary and an NGO. And the conversation went like this. It was about the successful implementation of remedial teaching in a summer camp. And the bureaucrat, a very, very senior officer of the government said, the thing is that we are very effective at doing these camps or doing missions. What we can't seem to do is to embed what we learn from these missions and these camps into the routine and everyday of our bureaucracy. Some years later, I heard an IAS officer lament that, India is, he said, the burial ground of pilots. There's a lot of really good ideas that get pilot tested in one village, in one district, in one state. But when it comes to scaling this up over time, we simply fail to do so. In other conversations, there was a lot of discussion about the need for reform champions. We need political will, we need political champions. We need bureaucratic will, we need bureaucratic champions. But once a champion goes away, the idea also dissipates and disappears. In the early years of my career in the World Bank, I attended the launch of a book that was written by a senior economist, which was documenting reforms, service delivery reforms in different parts of the country. And the one common feature in his presentation was the presence of bureaucratic champions. Leadership and looking for champions was identified by the World Bank as a very critical lever of what motivates change. And of course, everybody in the audience was puzzling over why is it that, once a champion goes, things fall apart. And if I take a 15-year horizon and look back at all the different things that were recorded in that book of ideas that were championed back in the day, you'll find that most of them haven't had a long-lasting life. They may have changed a few things, but they haven't dramatically reformed the bureaucracy. So it was these questions that was the primary puzzle that I was trying to understand. And the method I chose to try and understand those was to try and document from the grassroots up, the point at which reforms have to be implemented up, what exactly the reform process looks like, to understand why is it that it doesn't stick over the long time. I myself had a very great interest in education, and I worked very closely with the NGO Pratham in Delhi, which is a national NGO in India, one of the pioneers in thinking about the challenge of learning outcomes. They are the ones that put the sunlight on the fact that we've built schools, we've hired teachers, we've enrolled children, but children are coming to school and not able to learn very much. And the Ahsan surveys, a version of which I know is also run in Pakistan, was really one of the pioneers in pushing this understanding into the policy ecosystem. So Pratham also has experimented a lot with this method called teaching at the right level, which is essentially an attempt to think about the pedagogy in the classroom for periods of time, where teaching and children are brought together or grouped together, aligned not to the age grade requirement of the formal school system, but to levels of learning, and through a more creative pedagogy that is more activity-based, more engaging, they find that there are very quick improvements in children's learning level, at least at the level of foundational learning. So having been part of these efforts at Pratham, I felt that education was a useful sector because I understand it, I know its ins and outs, to be able to anchor this particular line of inquiry. So the attempt here was not to say whether or not the reform that we were studying was successful in its outcome, but really to try and understand what about these reforms as they unfolded created the opportunity or created barriers for deep long-term embeddedness in the education system. And we were very lucky and privileged that it so happened that there was a unique experiment underway in the city in which we live as researchers. And it also so happened that this reform was in education, that the reformers from the government, the city-state of Delhi, from the government of Delhi, were enthusiastic, at least in the early stages, to get third-party feedback of what was happening in schools, and so had approached us to document what was going on. And even more lucky, that one of the anchors of this reform was Pratham. So we were sort of experimenting with a version of teaching at the right level in these schools. And so we had some idea of what the overall reform project was. And therefore, we thought this is the perfect opportunity to really try and study this. There are two other very crucial conditions that were well embedded in the attempt to study the reform. The first most important one is that the reform champions were amongst the highest officers of this particular political party. So a new political party had been brought into power in Delhi, and they had made education one of their critical education reforms, one of their critical political policy agendas. And the finance minister of the state was also the deputy chief minister of the state, as also the education minister, for whom this is a passion project. So all the pieces of political will were firmly in place. And it was a long-term agenda. It wasn't something that they wanted to do one-off. The second important thing was that this was unfolding in our city, not just from the point of view of building up school infrastructure and strengthening school inputs, but a very well-articulated view was that the classroom itself is a victim of the pedagogy of the syllabus completion and the textbook, and therefore the classroom itself needed to be transformed. I will in just a minute give you a very quick glimpse of what a typical classroom in Delhi looks like, so that you get a better sense of exactly what this was. So at the start of our work, we were able to, over a period of time, observe what a typical classroom in Delhi looks like. So this is just some of our notes from our classroom observations. And I won't read out the details for lack of time, but it'll give you a quick sense of what a classroom looks like. The teacher takes the textbook, opens it up, reads out, writes something on the board, children copy it. The teacher will ask a few questions to the first 3 rows of the classroom who are exam ready in a sense. And everybody at the back is sort of left to try and catch up as much as they can. But the real pressure and focus of the teacher is on ensuring that what's written on the board is noted on the textbook, conceptual learning, grasping of the concepts. None of this really is number one on the teacher's agenda. And the reason why none of this is number one on the teacher's agenda is not necessarily because the teacher doesn't know how to teach, but because the teacher is embedded in what I call in our work, the classroom consensus. So one of the critical aspects of the reform that was underway was an attempt to try, in the beginning of the reform in 2017, sorry, I should give you one more background piece of information. For a very complicated reason, the political party that was elected into power in the city-state of Delhi only has control over schools starting at standard 6 up to standard 12. They are not the municipal school. The municipality deals with the municipal schools, which are the primary schools. So this reform started with students in class 6, and the attempt was for children between standard 6 and 8 to understand what level of learning they had. So can they recognize letters? Can they read? How far are they essentially from curriculum level expectations? And reorganize them into classrooms that are aligned to their proximity to what the curriculum expects them to do, in the hope that then teachers will be able to teach, quote unquote, differentially. So bring children that are further away from the curriculum forward into as close to the curriculum as expected, and therefore change the dynamic of the classroom from this typical classroom that I'm describing here in my presentation. At the start of this exercise, a baseline survey was done to get a measure of where children were. And that was followed by a parent-teacher meeting. What I found really fascinating when colleagues and I were sitting in the classroom, in the parent-teacher meeting, we were sitting in the staff room where the head teacher was sitting of the school. Parents were barging into the class, to the head teacher's room to say the following. They said, how can you test my child and take a decision on where they are in the classroom without informing us well in advance in order for us to be able to prepare the child so that they can, quote unquote, pass the exam? So parents were not interested in understanding what level of learning the children were at, or understanding the backdrop of why it is that this kind of effort was underway. For them, an examination is about the child passing the test, and an examination that doesn't enable the parent to prepare the child is a fault of the school. It sort of highlights the fact that this obsession with the typical classroom being about the teacher completing the syllabus, being about the teacher focusing on those children that are as close to the curriculum as possible, being about ensuring that the child actually quote unquote passes the exam regardless of whether the concepts have been grasped, is very much a larger societal issue, at least in India, and I think in many other parts of the world. And therefore, there is this wide classroom consensus. And what this reform was attempting to do was to try and break this classroom consensus. So in a way, what made it really exciting for us was to try and see what are the ways in which a reform tries to embed itself and try to shift the levers of everybody involved, from the teachers to the administrators, to try and move and break the classroom consensus. And at the heart of it was this attempt to try and do this differential teaching. But this differential teaching was not going to be implemented in a classroom that is divorced from the larger ecosystem within which it operates. So we adopted a series of ethnographic methods to better understand the ecosystem of the school, both in terms of the classroom consensus, as I have just described, but also what is the everyday context of the teacher and the school, its own everyday reality, and how that everyday reality responds to this attempt to break what is a very, very structural challenge of the classroom. Let me give you a very quick sense of what the classroom looks like. Of what the everyday bureaucratic experience and teachers' experience looks like. These are just some quotes that I have put together of what teachers and administrators. Now, the administrator is really important because the administrator is the person that the school, the teacher, the head teacher deals with on a daily basis, and therefore shapes what the school actually looks like. These are the kinds of strange things that we heard quite regularly and repeatedly. And I must add that this is not specific just to education. We hear this across different sectors and across different parts of the country. They, here are some of the things they say. They make us prepare files. They instill fear in us. We feel like we are antennas. The frontline bureaucracy in India is also very colorful in its expression. So I like this one because it really describes also the joys of doing ethnographic research of this kind. You get to hear different ways in which people choose to articulate themselves, and it's always interesting and exciting. So we feel like we are antennas, constantly receiving, processing, transmitting information. We are post officers. We asked, do you give suggestions about how you can change the dynamics of the classroom? What suggestions can I give? My first priority is just to implement orders. You could dismiss this, as many do who study bureaucracy in India, as just the lament of an apathetic, corrupt, inefficient, useless bureaucracy that wants to avoid doing work. All of these are facts. It is true that the frontline bureaucracy in India, and I think in many parts of South Asia, have these characteristics. In India, certainly they don't show up to work, corruption is rife, inefficiency, demotivation are all parts and parcels of the puzzle. But the repeatedness with which we heard this made us investigate this a little bit further. And we found that embedding our understanding in theories of understanding of norms of bureaucracy, the informal values, the ideas of purpose, how these collectively shape the everyday experiences of bureaucrats, was a more constructive and useful way by which we could understand why we were hearing these things repeatedly. The political scientist Akshay Mangala makes a very interesting distinction between what he calls legalistic norms and deliberative norms that shape the bureaucracy in India. Legalistic norms are basically norms of bureaucracy that use hierarchy and rules as a gospel. They tend to rarefy hierarchy and rules in ways that the state sees itself as responding to itself in its grammar of hierarchy and rules, rather than responding to the needs of people. Deliberative norms are norms that are shaped by the bureaucracy's embeddedness in the everyday lives of the people whose lives lives they are meant to serve. Deliberative bureaucracies tend to be more engaged with civil society. They tend to work much more with community groups. They tend to be much more communicative, and they're very willing to bend the rules in order to be able to implement programs in ways that make sense. So it's a more responsive bureaucracy to citizens as opposed to a more responsive bureaucracy to rules and norms. And if you look at the history of the South Asian bureaucracy, and the anthropologist Matthew Hull has this really interesting work that actually came out of his work in municipalities in Pakistan on the importance of paper in shaping the everyday life of local bureaucracy in India, in South Asia, which traces its history back to norms of trust from the East India Company days, where the local was charged with doing the everyday of the bureaucracy, but the elite was far away, and the elite didn't trust the local in terms of their ability to actually get things done, and therefore depended on paper to be able to make the judgment of things being done. So low trust environments take the Weberian imagination of hierarchy of bureaucracy and reify that so that it is the paper and the hierarchy that becomes the end rather than becomes a means to an end. And we saw this very much in our schools. We saw that, I like the framing of Dan Honing, who describes bureaucracies as accountability internally within bureaucracies as following either route X management practices or route Y management practices. And I see in the Indian system, and certainly in the schools of Delhi, a very visible route X management of philosophy, accountability philosophy, which is about extracting accountability through top-down, coercive rules, norms, distributed through orders and circulars, which are at the heart of what makes a bureaucracy operate, where command and control is seen as the way of extracting accountability rather than deliberation and discretion, which is what Dan Honing describes as the route Y philosophy of accountability. And in fact, these orders and circulars are very visible in the schools of Delhi. In the period that we were in these schools, about 3 years, we were able to track 8,000 plus government orders and circulars that were related to different aspects of the daily functioning of the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy would work, the school would work on quite literally, and I'm not in fact caricaturing this, but the start of the day of a headmaster in a school in Delhi and many other parts of India is to put on their computer and download from the MIS system, the management information system, what specific order they have received for the day. And it is that order that shapes the activities and the priorities of the school for the day, not the needs of the classroom. These circulars use a very command and control sanctioning kind of language. They say things like mandatory, you are directed to, you should do, if you do not do this, you will be penalized, creating an imagination, both of the teacher, the head teacher, the administrator, that is linked to the school, that your job really is to respond to what is ordered of you, what is asked of you. So if something is ordered, if a reform is ordered, parts of it may well get implemented in a school, coming back to the original point of inquiry, why do things not get embedded? If the system is moving on to the next challenge that it wants to try and resolve, and the orders start reducing and new orders come in, inevitably in an environment like this, the old will be forgotten and the new will take over. It also creates an imagination that the government can do many things, but I'm only a response to the government, which is why we kept hearing them say we are nothing but post officers. So one of the things many say, and again, it is very similar in different parts of the country, सरकार अगर चाहती है तो बहुत कुछ कर सकती है, मगर मैं नहीं कर सकता. And for an outsider talking to these government people, we found it really absurd because it had all the trappings of power. They were from the outside. We are from the outside. We can see that people want to be in government for power. They are exercising their power in different ways. But that is the power of authority towards the citizen, not the power of authority internally to do something for the citizen, which in a sense shapes the frontline of the Indian state in ways that basically make them nothing more but passive recipients of orders rather than active agents of change. So moving these active agents of change away from being, moving these passive recipients of orders, into active agents of change is really the heart of the task that reformers confront. But because reformers too are embedded in this imagination of a state that is primarily about orders, circulars, command and control, they order things, they try to get things done through these orders without really getting into the heart of what it takes to move these agents, active agents of change. I would argue that several aspects of the reform in Delhi, in fact, tried to make these changes. And in some ways, they were trying to address this challenge of what I see as a challenge of worker motivation. How do you understand the conditions under which workers are working, shrinking, and sabotaging? Why is it so normal for teachers and head teachers to repeatedly tell us that they are only post officers? A lot of the literature also tells us that some of the conditions for change in systems are linked to autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So your ability to have a sense of freedom, the ability to feel that you're competent at what you're doing, and the ability to respond effectively to and relate to what is being asked of you. To what extent do these reforms actually try and create these conditions for officers? The Delhi reforms tried this. They tried this by trying to regularly speak to teachers. The minister who was at the helm of the reforms would regularly come on the radio, on television, in newspapers, gave motivational speeches, all that were aimed to create this sense of autonomy, of competence, to create a sense of relatedness where the teachers would also think of themselves very much as part and parcel of this ecosystem of reform. But the everyday life of the school remained untouched. And that's where the tensions between the imagination of change and the actual implementation of the reform became visible and became unfolded. So it was sort of an attempt to try and break the legalistic norms, but the everyday experience of implementation was very much still governed by the root X, which started undermining elements of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The second attempt that was tried was to try and shift the organizational purpose of the classroom. One of the challenges of this very legalistic context is that teachers think of themselves as being undermined because they're being pushed away from the classroom and pushed to focus much, much more on all these administrative tasks that are demanded of them by the orders. That takes them away from actually asking and trying to answer questions about the possibilities of change within their classrooms. And it is here that parts of the reality of the reforms started finding themselves in a block. So so at one level, the attempt was to try and align the classroom to the levels of learning of children, but the teachers did not feel themselves completely, didn't think of themselves as having the autonomy to actually think of the classroom differently, because from their perspective, they've never actually been free to teach the way they want to teach. So a new pedagogical innovation is coming in. But teachers are not really ready for that new pedagogical innovation, because in their minds, they're still not recognizing that there is also something about the way you teach that is a problem. So one of the things we realized is, in the midst of all of this, a reading week was announced. The reading week was, a reading camp was announced with a goal that on the 14th of November, which in India is celebrated as Children's Day, all children in classes 6 to 8 who are quote unquote non-readers, there still were many children who could barely read who could just about recognize letters and could not read comprehensively, that the teacher would be free to take the child outside of the classroom setting to teach the children using different pedagogical tools and get them to the level of the reader. And we found that when teachers started speaking about this, they would talk very much about how all of these changes were actually shifting their ability the changed way of teaching was shifting their ability to focus on learning levels of children and to understand where the children were far better than how they were in the classroom. They recognized this, they spoke about it. Yet when we would take the conversation back to the classroom, the teachers would tell us about all these different aspects of what it is about the classroom, which are all about the lack of autonomy, a sense of a lack of competence, an inability to understand what the reform was all about, and a sense that their organizational purpose is something that is being taken away from the classroom, all of which basically made them feel that the classroom teaching pedagogy was not the problem, it was everything outside. So we saw this complete cognitive dissonance. And it made us realize that the honest truth is reforms are never implemented in a vacuum. Change occurs when you recognize that this is the reality in which reforms are being implemented. And you will always have aspects of change that are sabotaged and aspects of change that get embedded. And in fact, one mode, ironically, of that embeddedness are precisely the missions that set me on this research mission in the first place. That maybe if you think about the mission as an opportunity to show to the teacher the possibility of change, you will actually see that there is a possibility of shifting the imagination, but over a period of repeated missions. So one of the things that the government of Delhi did is that in the midst of all of this, they introduced in 2018 a new remedial program, which they call the Mission Bunyad. And the first round of Mission Bunyad was somewhat poorly implemented with a little bit lack of ownership. But over the course of 2 years, the process of implementing Mission Bunyad improved significantly. The idea that you can take children outside of the classroom and very quickly do remedial learning, help teachers get exposed to the possibility of change. And then schools closed for 2 years because of COVID. When schools finally reopened, the entire system was aligned to now start thinking about Mission Bunyad in a serious, effective, comprehensive way. I'm still to study this seriously. We are going to do a survey in schools over the next month and a half. However, one of the things I have noticed in the schools in Delhi, having spent some time there now and comparing with how teachers used to speak even 2 years ago, is that now that their children are coming back after COVID, the ability to have a dialogue amongst themselves about learning loss and what the levers of change should be, the ability to comprehensively implement this version of teaching at the right level, with an ability to also stay with the child all the way from level 0 to the level that you want to get them to before you start the syllabus, which is when you can actually read a paragraph. All changed dramatically. There was no sabotage. There's complete alignment. So this makes me realize that, in fact, multiple missions that expose entrenched systems to the possibility of a purpose beyond the purpose that they have been experiencing, the purpose of administration to the purpose of learning, can over a period of time create possibilities of change. So that's one lever of change. And the second really important lever of change to my mind is the constant presence of principal change agents inside the system who are part of the system, not the reform champion from the outside, but the reform champion from the inside. To explain, there was an attempt to create a cohort of mentor teachers in 2017 who were part of the school system, who were embedded in these schools. Some were extremely successful, some less so, but it is these mentor teachers that have stayed in the system regardless of the presence of these so-called reform champions, and have slowly but surely been able to shift the gear of the conversation in the staff room very, very carefully, very, very slowly and very, very subtly, away from just an obsession with have you completed the syllabus and how many children have passed the exam, to some conversation between teachers about the possibilities of what different ways in which they can teach so that the child is closer to what the syllabus expects, the curriculum expects them to be, and can actually pass the exams. So there are possibilities of levers of change, but to identify those, all reform efforts need to recognize that they are implemented not in a vacuum, but in the everyday realities of deeply entrenched broken systems. And we need to understand the dynamics of how broke the broke is by studying the systems, and ethnography helps to understand that, and then think about reimagining reforms in the context of how they would be responded to in these systems. In Delhi, we learned many missions, multiple times, over long periods of time, expose even the most hardened teacher to the possibility of change. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Yamini, for this fascinating talk. Rabea, over to you. Would you like to begin questions? And while I invite you for asking questions, I will invite everybody to please put your questions in the chat. You're very welcome to ask Ms. Yamini for questions. Ji, Rabea, would you like to go first, or shall I? Ji.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just sort of say, so this was absolutely, I think the richness the data that have come through that help us understand, I think, is the power of qualitative work, actually. And to me, I just wanted to make that comment, and perhaps we can link this with a question later on, is to demonstrate, I think, that power of qualitative work for understanding the kinds of reforms and how they actually get implemented. So a huge sort of compliment to this kind of work, and for us to understand it's difficult to do, but once done well, what it's able to reveal is fantastic. So Yamini, what was very interesting to me was your mention of trust and your mention of autonomy. And I just wanted to sort of, if you could reflect a bit more on in your communication with senior bureaucrats in particular. It seems to me that this notion of autonomy, which is now part of a lot of discourse, mainstream discourse on policy reform, in decentralization even, is linked with the notion of trust, which is not at all mentioned quite often. So how do we sort of link a conceptual framework, and to what extent can we now generate information about how much we trust each other, actually, and how much teachers are trusted to be able to problem solve? I'll stop here.
So, thanks for that question. I think it's really at the heart of the challenge. And again, let me go back to the sort of origins of bureaucracy, the sort of passion that it holds for paper as a means of getting things done. Low trust environments tend to use rules as a means of defining and limiting, I think, accountability in a way that's extremely, in my view, unhelpful. It defines and limits accountability by defining accountability as a process of accounting for different steps that are taken, and the paper becomes the sort of means through which that accounting happens. So, if you explore the Indian bureaucracy, and again, I think there's a lot of overlap between most South Asian bureaucracies and probably certainly the British and French bureaucracy too, that the paper becomes the artifact on the basis of which the reality of the bureaucracy is told. And so whatever happens outside of the paper, which is large, the voucher, the account book, etc., that becomes the heart of what determines what gets done. So, when we used to do this expenditure tracking kind of exercise, the thing that I used to find really fascinating is that everybody in the system was obsessed with trying to show that they have spent money before March 31st, which is the end of the financial year in India, in order to be able to deliver what they call a utilization certificate. What the money was spent on, where it went, whatever. But the utilization certificate is really important, because the utilization certificate doesn't go into the system. The audits will say that something has gone wrong, or and most importantly, the next year's tranche of money is not going to be released, because that is the holy grail on the basis of which money starts moving. So the accounting is how accountability gets exposed and imposed. And the obsession with corruption is also part of that narrative. So, it's not an obsession because corruption is reality, but the extent to which that dominates our understanding and imagination, right? So one of the standard excuses given to not decentralize, so don't give huge amounts of funds and powers to local governments, is because local governments are corrupt. And the only way that you can hold the local government accountable is to have a command and control, tightly monitored system. And, by the way, technology allows that even more, because you get the CCTV camera inside the classroom. Even Delhi has CCTV cameras inside the classroom, don't ask. Biometrics, all kinds of ways in which you want to try and track and hold and ensure the accounting is appropriate. It misses the fact that accountability is ultimately about norms. It's ultimately about being embedded in a context where there's a set of things that we need to do that then generate horizontal as well as vertical forms of accountability. For example, the fact that we are having this conversation today, there's no need in an accounting strict sense for me to be spending this hour with you or for you to be spending this hour listening to me. We are doing it because within our ecosystem, the legitimacy of what we do is shaped by our ability to engage with each other and respond to each other's work. That legitimacy makes us accountable for ensuring that we produce a certain level or quality of work for which we are then accountable. So we become automatically accountable because that's built into our norms, right? It's not about if you stick a biometric in my office, it's unlikely that I will produce high quality research. But if I have to talk to you and you'll catch me up if my methodology is poor, I'm forced to be more. So it's sort of, Land Pritchett has this very nice distinction between accounting for accountability versus account for accountability. And I think the account is what is at the heart of what builds trust. And unfortunately, in our hierarchical structures, the account has been dismissed in favor of accounting. Just one more nugget and I'll stop. There was a huge case of corruption in our national health program now almost a decade and a half ago. And the national health program had originally been designed with the objective of ensuring that there would be as much flexibility at the state and grassroots level in order for expenditures to be aligned with local needs, local health needs. Very, very sensibly done. After that corruption case, that 5 line items became 2,000 line items of an Excel sheet for planning, and you couldn't move from one Excel row to the next without getting multiple permissions. And to move money, my colleagues traced this in one state. The file had to go to get signed off on 32, I kid you not, 32 desks before the state treasury actually released the money. So you can imagine how long that must take and how much of a bottleneck this accounting becomes to effectively delivering public services. And it reinforces this idea that I'm just a passive agent responding to orders, not an active person responsible for delivering quality public services to citizens.
Thank you so much, Yamini. A quick question that I'll ask myself, and there are a couple of very interesting questions in the chat box also. My question is that as I listen to you, I feel that we had everything going against the reforms to be embedded. So you had actors who were passive, you used the word cognitive dissonance of teachers because this was different from the way they were doing things. There was a difference from, or a departure from, classroom consensus where the focus was on exams. And yet the only thing that seemed to have helped, despite those shoulds and despite those, very directive paperwork that was coming, is the consistency of policies and constant backing of the government. So if we were to take a lesson from here, that how would things work, what is a broad lesson that we take in? So do we sort of go about still doing things the same way and somehow we do end up having it embedded in our behavior? Over to you.
1 minute. I'm just going to share one slide that I didn't share for lack of time, which I think answers your question. So, having mapped this whole story, what do I think are the features that could be identified as levers of change? And these are the 3 that I think seem to make the most amount of sense. They seem commonsensical at one level, but they're often exactly the opposite of what reforms are about. One important aspect is this investment in relationship building. The one thing we heard continuously in the schools is, while they complained a lot about constantly having to go for meetings, constantly having to go for trainings, constantly having to deal with visits from the bosses above, the fact that these things were a repeated and constant engagement, and the one advantage that a reform in Delhi has is that it's spatially very confined. So it's easy for top level bureaucrats, top level officials, outsiders like us, to constantly be coming in and out of the schools, asking about what is happening and keeping the buzz alive. Usually when you get these reform champions sitting monitoring on the top, at least in the India case, an order will be issued, occasional site monitoring visits will happen, some talk will happen, but it doesn't become part of the everyday. So this regularity was a very important thing, which initially we did not recognize. In fact, we saw it as a problem because the teachers kept saying, you're distracting me from all the tasks I have by turning up on a regular basis and doing all this monitoring. But the regularity also had one common thread in its conversation, at least from the point of view of the reformers. And that common thread was, children's learning levels. Are children learning? What are the bottlenecks to learning? So that too, I think, created some imagination inside the class, inside the schools, about the importance of what the broad and ability to relate to the broad goal and purpose of the reform. The second important aspect was nurturing of the disruptive change agents, the mentor teachers that I briefly mentioned. I think they were actually key anchors of the whole thing. Great efforts were made to send them out to Singapore, to Finland, to various places, to get exposure to Cambridge, to Oxford. And, at one level, one can dismiss all of this as unnecessary waste of public money. But what it did do is it identified amongst them, out of 5, you'll get 2 who are genuinely interested. And these people circulate back. So they become mentor teachers for a while, and they go back to becoming teachers. And their constant presence and interest in what was happening, I think, at least kept the core of the reform discussion alive inside the classrooms. And last, as I mentioned, this constant mission mode shift. Like I said, it was ironic that I came to this conclusion because we started out our investigation saying there's something wrong with a system that is obsessed with missions and can't roll it into its everyday. But on the other hand, a system that is repeatedly exposed to the same mission, one which shows some possibility of change, actually has greater possibility of aligning eventually than a mission that doesn't, than an attempt to reform that doesn't use the mission mode effectively.
Thank you so much, Yamini. There is a question in the chat by Dr. Gulab Khan, and he wanted to ask if teachers were a part of the conceptualization of this program, were they given some autonomy? And then maybe Rabea, over to you after Yamini answers this. Yamini.
Sure. Yes, teachers were part of this. In fact, in the early days, they were also asked to be part of creating some of the pedagogical material. There was a fair amount of sharing, but there was also a lot of resistance from teachers. They saw this as one more headache in what were already rather busy lives, where lots of orders were being given to them and things that had to be done, which was taking them away from focusing on the classroom. They were not at all convinced. I think even today, they are not entirely convinced, despite it having been something that's gone on for so long. And that's because they are embedded, they come from exactly the same system that the system was trying to change. They are still to be fully convinced that there is something about the pedagogy in the normal classroom that is also the challenge. So teachers were part of it, but teachers were also actively resisting it. And one of the great, sort of ironies at one level and huge challenges at another is that even though the teacher was left here in this case, particularly in the first 2 years, to design whatever pedagogy they wanted. So in a sense, the classroom was reorganized by levels of learning with the curriculum as the base. So those who were closer to the curriculum level were in one type of classroom, and those who were further away were at another. And teachers were told repeatedly that you're supposed to do differential teaching. Nobody knew what that meant because they are wedded, the teacher itself is wedded to the syllabus and to a particular style of teaching. And in fact, at one point when the syllabus was cut, teachers used that as an opportunity to do repeat revisions for those kids who were closer to curriculum level expectations. So it was autonomy was given, but in a system that is so deeply entrenched in responding to hierarchy, autonomy was something that no one quite knew what to do with, both because the hierarchy itself predominates your mindset, but also you are embedded and entrenched in a particular imagination, which is hard to break.
Thank you so much. Rabea, would you like to?
Thank you. Yamini, I wondered if you had a chance to take some of these sort of very expressive, very illustrative messages back to some of the bureaucrats in the system and how they've responded to this empirical sort of feedback coming about the implementation process of reform.
I mean, it's been interesting because in at least certainly in the first couple of years, the government was a partner in the research work, in that they were keen for feedback. It was early days, and they felt that they also wanted to kind of create, I guess, alignment across a large, network of individuals who could speak to the reform to build its own legitimacy. And so they saw in a research institution that is, well entrenched in the policy ecosystem, engaging with what they were doing as a possible, as part and parcel of the reform itself. So to begin with, the feedback was taken quite well. There was a drought in feedback after that. Everybody got busy, including us, in the sense that one of the challenges with ethnographic work is that, the insights take time to come, and maybe the everyday sometimes becomes so quotidian that, you're wondering what exactly you're learning by being there for periods of time. But we went through the process as we wrote this up. We've been in regular contact and sharing sessions. I think one of the things that made them respond, and at each point they have responded with enthusiasm, interest, and a willingness to learn. And I think one of the reasons why that has happened is that, and it's not like there isn't resistance, because ours is, it's a story that is, I think, at one level complementary to the reformists for trying to do something different, but at another equally somewhat skeptical of the reform because it presents its murkiness. So we're not coming out in what all political parties would like you to do, especially in a very hotly contested political environment, as is the environment right now in Delhi. They want you to say this is great. So they've got their own version. Somebody else is doing that for them. They allowed us to create, to have the space for this more complicated story. And because the story was anchored in a lot of the reality of their experience, and we've been careful to tell them the story through that prism, I think they find it hard to dispute it at any rate, and possibly, hopefully, find some meaning in it as well.
Thank you so much, Yamini. So can I sort of put a few questions, and you can take time to answer all those together. I'll put 2 or 3 questions together. So there is one question by Eamon Khwaja, and she's saying, what seems to be at work over here? She wants to know who are the change agents. And she says, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the bureaucracy, command and control seems to work. So that is one question. The second one is there is a request to explain the concept of classroom consensus. And the third question is that, do you think, once this is over, what I mean is when these students go to other levels of schooling upwards, so this is something that will be lost over time. And please take my question also. So what are the lessons from here that we can keep in mind when we are thinking of post-COVID education and also post-floods? Because as you know, how Pakistan is really going through this, had to face this devastating flood problem, and pushing so many other students out of school. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for these fantastic questions. Let me try and pick up as many of them as I have. The classroom consensus. What I mean by that is, there is a broad social consensus in India that the education system is largely what the Nobel Prize laureates Abhijit Sen and Esther Duflo describe as a sorting mechanism. It is about identifying the best amongst the wheat amongst the chaff, in a sense, and nurturing them to be able to work the system. I think that's how India is able to produce, the global best that are globally competitive. And then there's this whole rest of India that is, still 50% of children who finish 5 years of schooling barely able to read standard 2 text. So, and it is in that ecosystem of a sorting mechanism, we view the education system very much as a system that is anchored in the ability to maximize the examination. So for the teacher, maximize pass percentages, for the student, pass the exam. And same for the parent. So the fact that, parents were storming into the headmaster's office once when we were sitting there saying, how can you test our children without telling us in advance? And now you're reorganizing their classrooms. Of course, the child is going to do badly if the child doesn't prepare for the exam. These are all ways of understanding the education system very much as a sorting structure rather than as something that is about to, at least at the foundational level, try and build these basic elements of conceptual learning into rote learning. And I'm not completely pedagogically, and this is going to be controversial, but I'm no pedagogist, but just as a parent who's constantly dealing with children in primary school, I do think that there is some value to a certain amount of discipline of testing and rote learning. But the problem is when the system is designed to only focus on those that are at curriculum level expectation and not those that are in a completely different distanced from that. And it's not able to incentivize the teacher to focus on those children that are at the back of the classroom. This is where the question of what gets lost when students go upward. I mean, I think one of the challenges with this particular reform is that once you finish 8 years of schooling, you then get into the high stakes next level. And I don't think any system in the world has been able to figure out how do you ensure that you identify, that's where the sorting actually starts mattering a lot. So there is a set of high stakes exams that are going to shape life chances across the globe, even in the best of education systems. How do you do this in a way that encourages all elements of conceptual learning, et cetera, well-being, and so on, and be able to deal with what is meant to be high levels of competition? In the Indian case, this is even more complicated by the fact that our foundations are really weak. So if on average, 50% of children who finish 5 years of schooling can barely read a class 2 text, you're in a place where this child is going from class to class to class, as Lan Pritchard's work highlights. And only 2 in 5 who could not read in standard 2 will be able to read in standard 5. That's 3 who can't. Right. So Land sort of describes this as the negative consequences of an overambitious curriculum. But this is the challenge that we have. So when the child is going all the way up to class 9, you get a huge dropout. You get a huge dropout because in class 10, you get to the high stakes exam and they are just not able to cope. So what this was trying to do was, in a way, it was sold to parents as an attempt to actually build the system's ability to ensure that kids are as close to curriculum level expectations as possible so that they would be in a better position to take the standard 9 exam and move forward. What we hope it would hold on is the exposure of the teacher to the possibilities of a pedagogy that is not just about syllabus completion, but about focusing on where the child is at and how is it that you can adjust your teaching in a way that you could enable the child to come forward. So teachers are not unaware that when you're in class 6, you still have 50% of kids who are not able to read letters. Okay, who are not able to comprehend, and the curriculum is taking you at a completely different level. The first test that the government of Delhi did, and the Manish Sisodiya, the reform champion, was on radio very regularly saying 70% of kids who are in standard 6 can't read a standard 6 text. So that's the reality, which is not a new thing for a teacher, but the teacher doesn't know how they can move the needle from 70% to at least 40%. What this does is expose you to how you can teach in a way that actually deals with these multiple levels of learning in the classroom and focus differently on different types of children. And I think that it's taken 5 or 6 years, but at least recent conversations I've had with teachers post-COVID seems to suggest that some elements of this may actually stay with them in their everyday teaching, which is why I think the focus here for me was not whether learning outcomes suddenly dramatically improved. It is whether teachers began to understand what shifts were needed to change, to move the needle. And that's where I think the lessons for post-COVID and the floods come. I don't know. I think Pakistan did a better job of keeping schools open than India did. For the most part, schools in India were closed for 2 years. And it is, children are walking into schools now. We don't even have a basic baseline assessment. That's what really worries me. But children are walking into schools without having had any exposure to education for a period of time and significant learning losses. What are we doing for standards 1 to 3? Will have a different set of requirements. 3 to 5 will have a different set of remedial requirements. In Delhi, in these schools that start in class 6, just to give you a case study of one school I was in 2 weeks ago, 900 kids at this out of 2,000, of which about 1,500, so more than half were actually coming. Nearly half the kids could not recognize letters at the start of the school year when schools reopened after COVID. These are standard 6 kids. And by systematically working with these kids in a sort of teaching at the right level kind of remedial framing, they managed to reduce that from 900 to now the last 50. And actually now we are in a position to have a conversation with the teachers about who these last 50 are. Are these children with disabilities? Are these children that need a certain kind of support because of their home conditions? Are these children that are just not, some children will just not progress? So how do we give them other kinds of skills, life skills, so that they are able to better cope with the world? These conversations would have been impossible without all of this. So I think in terms of lessons post-COVID, the lesson that you do now need to start with where the child is, both psychologically, emotionally, as well as in terms of their learning levels, before you can go back to that syllabus, is an important lesson that we must bear in mind in how we think about our strategies.
Thank you so much, Yamini, for this very insightful talk. Rabea, would you like to say a few words before we close?
Just that, fantastic insights, really, really clear sort of directions also for us. It was an absolute pleasure to engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a privilege to be able to talk to all of you, and thanks for the wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arslan, for putting it all together. Marwa, thank you for the audience. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you. Bye.